It's Washington's erratic policy toward China. Our relations with China, of course, as a great power, are absolutely fundamental to global stability and regional stability in the next century. It's of enormous importance to all of us. We're very fortunate to have with us a significant authority on the topic. I'm absolutely amazed by our guest's productivity. I have to mention the numbers just because I'm so impressed. About 12 co-edited and authored books, approximately 200 articles of various lengths. They've been published in the nation's finest journals, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, National Interest, and others. It's a wonderful record of serious scholarship with respect to great public policy questions. And in addition to the very serious treatment, he's discussed public policy for the good of the society through all of the major formats of radio and television, as well as the media. Dr. Carpenter was educated first at the university, well, not first, but his college education was at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee for his master's, his BA and master's degree in American history. And then he received a PhD in diplomatic history from the University of Texas. He's a generalist in American foreign policy. He's done a lot of work on NATO and the question of our alliances, using that as a focal point really for the study of American foreign policy at the beginning of the last decade. He's also worked on the United Nations, on defense matters of various kinds, on Asian affairs, South Korea relations, for example. He presently serves as vice president of Cato Institute's Defense and Foreign Policy Studies program. And it's in that capacity, as an acknowledged expert, that we present him to you this evening.
Thank you very much for that most kind introduction, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be here speaking before the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs and to be in Baltimore again. This is one of my favorite cities. We spend a great deal of time here, although mainly for recreational purposes, not for business purposes, but it's always a pleasure to get back here. The topic tonight could scarcely be more timely if we had scheduled this event a couple weeks ago rather than several months ago. Obviously, relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China are absolutely critical, and that relationship received two major blows in the past month. The first, of course, the inadvertent bombing, at least the United States says it was inadvertent. Officials in the PRC have a somewhat different view, but let us assume that it was an inadvertent bombing of the PRC embassy in Belgrade. That led to rioting in Beijing and other cities directed against the United States. The American ambassador to China, former Senator Sasser, had to avoid even venturing out from his residence because he could not be sure of his own safety. And then, just when that incident began to ebb, we had the Cox report on alleged espionage by the People's Republic of China. A lengthy report that describes apparent attempts by PRC agents to gather intelligence on the most sensitive aspects of American technology and American weaponry over the course of the past 2 decades. The Chinese government has vehemently denied the charges, contended that this report is an attempt by conservatives primarily, to torpedo the U.S.-Chinese relationship, to establish the foundation for a containment policy directed against China, and to, in essence, create a new Cold War, this time with China as the primary target instead of the Soviet Union. We now have a debate that will take place very soon on extending normal trade relations between the United States and the PRC for another year. The debate in Congress promises to be the most contentious that it has ever been, even in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre. We have, for the first time, a very real possibility that one house of Congress may vote against the President's certification of China as an appropriate candidate for normal trade relations. That would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. But it suggests the degree of tension that it now exists in the relations between the United States and China. This is merely the latest episode in a rather turbulent relationship. The United States has an extraordinarily difficult time striking an appropriate balance in its policy toward China. And this is not a new phenomenon. American policy and American attitudes seem to oscillate between the extremes of viewing China as a wannabe America, a future democratic power, and a vast market for American goods and investment on the one hand, or China as the great menace, a mortal threat to American security and American values. And one can see this ebb and flow in American attitudes going back well into the previous century. As I said, this is not a terribly new phenomenon. But we have seen it encapsulated in the policy of the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton, when he campaigned for the presidency in 1992, made a major plank in his campaign platform, criticism of the Bush administration's policy toward China. He said it was too soft and that it sacrificed key American values, especially on the issue of human rights, to crass commercial concerns. And candidate Clinton promised that he would link the issues of trade and human rights. As president, Mr. Clinton began almost immediately to back away from that position. There were a few efforts, to be sure, during the first year of his presidency to link those issues, and the president and his foreign policy team got a rude awakening, namely that Beijing was absolutely unreceptive even to holding a discussion of human rights issues and the linkage to trade. Faced with that defiance, a little more than a year into his presidency, Mr. Clinton announced a change in policy, that Washington would now de-link the issues of human rights and trade. Trade would proceed on a normal basis, on a commercial basis, and American representatives instead would quietly bring up the issue of human rights in other fora. Predictably, the president's change of policy was castigated by one wing of the Republican Party, a conservative faction that had always been suspicious of the PRC, even when Richard Nixon went to China and started the process of normalizing relations, even when that patron saint of American conservatism, Ronald Reagan, created a de facto alliance with the PRC to thwart Soviet power and Soviet expansionism. During all those years, conservative ideologues seethed with resentment and felt that important American interests had been sold out. With a Democrat in the White House, they felt perhaps a bit freer to vent those criticisms, and indeed they did, often making their more commercially oriented colleagues in the Republican Party, the members of what I call the Kissinger, Bush, Scowcroft wing of the Republican Party, at least as nervous as they made their Democratic adversaries. And one sees the pressure begin to mount for a more hard-line policy toward China. Pressure for that centered in Congress, even in 1993 and 94, and even more so after the Republican victories in the congressional elections of 1994. The Clinton administration, meanwhile, tried to steer a middle course, taking a relatively hard-line policy toward China, but again, keeping the commercial relationship on an even keel. And for a while, that seemed to work. Then, in the summer of 1995, the United States received a request from Lee Teng-hui, the president of the Republic of China on Taiwan. President Lee wanted to visit in an unofficial capacity and to attend a reunion at his alma mater, Cornell. The administration was inclined to deny the request. And in fact, there is evidence, I have received information on this from sources I certainly consider reliable, that U.S. officials conveyed that information to Beijing. However, support for President Lee's visit was enormous in Congress. Not just within the Republican Party, but even most Democrats felt that that was in the American tradition to allow someone to come to this country and not to give in to pressure or intimidation from Beijing. Reluctantly, the administration approved the visa. Beijing felt not only this was an unfriendly act, but that the PRC had been deceived by the United States. And again, the suspicion begins to ratchet up a notch. China decided to respond to President Lee's visit and what PRC officials thought it symbolized, namely a growing campaign by the Taipei government to win international space, to win international recognition. The PRC responded with a series of military exercises, including missile launches in the Taiwan Strait. The United States felt this was a challenge that could not be ignored, dispatched 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to waters near Taiwan in the early months of 1996. What is both interesting and important about that episode is there is now evidence that the two countries may have come far closer to an armed clash than anyone realized at that time. In fact, quite dangerously close to an armed clash. That event really spooked the Clinton administration. And from the spring of 1996 until quite recently. There was a concerted effort on the part of the administration to repair the relationship with the PRC. This effort progressed so far that in the spring and summer of 1998, U.S. officials are beginning to adopt the preferred terminology of PRC leaders when describing the relationship between the United States and China. That is, the two countries have a strategic partnership. One sees U.S. officials beginning to use that terminology even in 1997. By early 1998, it becomes quite frequent. It is interspersed with other terminology. Secretary of State Albright, for example, often referred to the relationship as a strategic partnership, a constructive partnership, a strategic relationship, and a constructive relationship, without any apparent realization that those terms have somewhat different connotations. Now, I'm not a great admirer of Secretary of State Albright, as anyone who's familiar with my writings will attest. But this struck me as especially dangerous, loose talk. The effort to consolidate a friendly relationship with the PRC culminated with President Clinton's visit to China in late June and early July of 1998. In that visit, the President and his key advisors did a number of things to signal that the strategic partnership may not have been just rhetoric. In a speech in Shanghai, the President seemed to tilt toward Beijing's position on the key issue of Taiwan, the so-called three no's, that the United States would not support a policy that envisioned an independent Taiwan, or two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan. And then the President went even further. He said that the United States would not support Taiwanese membership in any international organization for which statehood was a requirement. Now, this didn't go quite as far as Beijing desired, but it certainly took a number of steps along that path. This again enraged hardliners and some not so hardliners in Congress. They proceeded to pass a resolution affirming that American policy toward Taiwan was governed by the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 and that there was no change in U.S. policy. That was, at the very least, an implicit rebuke to President Clinton. The talk of a strategic partnership between the United States and the PRC also led to some interesting developments in Asia. The government of India cited not only what it saw as the Chinese threat to India's security, but an apparent condominium between the United States and the PRC to create a global spheres of influence, with India apparently being consigned to the PRC's sphere. And they cited these developments as the key reasons for the decision to unveil India's nuclear weapons program. You also see developments in Japan at the same time. Both India and Japan were upset by a number of aspects during the Clinton trip to China. India was upset by a joint statement issued by President Clinton and President Jiang Zemin, outlining an important role for both the United States and the PRC in preventing nuclear proliferation in South Asia and for solving the disputes and conflicts in that region. When India protested that this was done without even so much as informing New Delhi, Secretary of State Albright responded as though the Indian government was the most impertinent institution she had ever encountered. How dare New Delhi criticize a joint US-PRC statement on South Asia? Needless to say, the Indian government did not react well to that criticism. Japan was equally upset by joint statements on a variety of economic issues with Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and his Chinese counterpart issuing statements to the effect that the U.S. and the PRC were cooperating closely in trying to contain and reverse the East Asian financial crisis, and criticizing Japan for not doing nearly enough to get its own economic house in order or to help deal with the regional financial and economic crisis. Japanese officials were stunned, said they couldn't recall another occasion in which U.S. and Chinese officials, at least since World War II, had issued a statement criticizing Japanese policy and implying that Washington and Beijing had a closer relationship on this issue, closer policy coordination, than did Washington and Tokyo. The Japanese begin to make their own decisions on a number of issues. For instance, when North Korea launched its botched satellite launch, at least that's what U.S. intelligence said that it was, the Japanese government and public reacted with skepticism. To this day, I think a majority of Japanese officials believe this was a missile test over the territory of Japan. It was not a satellite launch that failed. Tokyo immediately makes a decision to develop its own system of spy satellites. Now that's a not very subtle statement to the United States. We do not want to rely on your intelligence gathering and evaluation anymore. Thank you. We will make our own evaluation, our own decisions. We have also seen a number of signs that the Japanese self-defense forces are becoming a bit more active and assertive. When a North Korean ship intruded into Japanese waters, the naval forces of Japan immediately responded by chasing the interloper and making it clear they would take forcible action if such an incident occurred again. So Washington's attempt, or at least its talk about a strategic partnership with China, triggered uneasiness and uncertainty throughout Asia and led to more independent actions on the security front by at least two key powers, India and Japan. When the administration realized that this kind of reaction had taken place in Asia and that its talk of a strategic partnership was bringing condemnation in Congress and among key opinion groups in the United States, we see then a hasty retreat. And I don't believe the term strategic partnership has been used at all by U.S. officials in the past 5 to 6 months. We now have a debate underway about the direction of U.S. policy toward China. The administration and its supporters contend that we must pursue a policy of engagement, and this is how the President and his foreign policy team see current U.S. policy. Critics in Congress insist that they do not want to isolate China. They do not want to adopt a Cold War-style policy toward Beijing, but they argue the administration's policy is at the very least naive, that China is a potential threat, a possible enemy, that we therefore must be highly selective in what products we export to the PRC, particularly in the area of high tech, in the areas that can be useful to the PRC in modernizing and improving the quality of its military. I find these trends extremely disturbing, just the way this debate is developing. It threatens to be a debate of caricatures. On the one hand, people who really are convinced that China is going to be America's principal enemy in the next century, and they seem determined to adopt policies that are very likely to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other hand, you do have some people who seem to believe in engagement for engagement's sake. And you wonder whether such people have a congenital inability to remove their tongues from Jiang Zemin's boot. I think we need a more sober, a more balanced policy. We better get it right soon. We cannot continue to oscillate between these two extremes. For the first time in American history, I think we have to have a sober, balanced, realistic policy toward China. That balance means we should not treat China as an enemy, definitely not. We should maintain in general terms a policy of engagement. But we also need to be prudent enough to understand we do not know for certain what kind of great power China is going to become in the 21st century. We have powerful incentives working on the PRC that could lead either to China becoming a stable, relatively democratic, cooperative status quo power in the international system. What are some of those factors? The tremendous economic ties that China has developed with quite a number of countries in East Asia, with the members of the European Union, and especially with the United States. Any government in Beijing is going to be reluctant to jeopardize those ties by disruptive, aggressive behavior. We also have a generational change taking place in China. The emergence into middle age of a political and economic elite that is well educated, sophisticated, and in many cases, people who have been educated in Western universities. I have dealt with a good number of them, and I can tell you that a significant percentage of them regard the aging autocrats in Beijing at the very least as a nuisance. And they certainly want to change the political system in China, but they also want to do it in a way that is gradual, that preserves the overall stability of the country. Not an easy task, but at least in a general sense, they are committed to China becoming a democratic country. On the other hand, there are a number of factors that suggest that China might become a disruptive, abrasive, and perhaps even very aggressive revisionist power. What are some of those factors? First of all, the legacy of a very difficult history beginning in the early 1800s, when a weak China was thoroughly mistreated by the colonial powers. That has left tremendous emotional scars. And I think you have to really grasp that to understand why the Chinese showed such enormous enthusiasm for the recovery of Hong Kong. I was in Beijing and Shanghai in the days leading up to the reversion of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty. And I can tell you that the enthusiasm I saw was genuine. There was a sense of national pride, a sense that finally justice on this issue had been achieved. This was not something just whipped up by the government or the Communist Party cadres. But other territorial grievances remain. Territory that were amputated by other powers during China's long period of weakness and humiliation. Areas taken by Tsarist Russia. And of course, the issue of Taiwan, always hanging there, the issue of Taiwan. There are also PRC claims to the Spratly Islands and other islands in the South China Sea that many Chinese regard as absolutely unchallengeable, that this is properly Chinese territory, and a proud and strong China will make good on that claim. We also have the role of the history of international relations that leads to a somewhat sobering conclusion. Throughout history, rising great powers tend to be disruptive, abrasive, revisionist powers. We have the examples of Wilhelmine Germany and Japan earlier in this century. And although Americans don't want to recall it all that much, the example of the United States of America in the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. I have a good many friends in Latin America who have told me on more than a few occasions that the experience of their countries proved conclusively that it was not easy being a neighbor of the United States during that period. That history suggests that China may be a real problem during the first quarter or the first half of the 21st century. Now, how do we deal with that? We don't know what kind of China is going to emerge in the next century. The proper policy then is to hedge our bets. Try to maintain a cordial relationship. Definitely try to maintain and even intensify the economic ties whenever possible. Maximize the links that will encourage cooperative status quo behavior by Beijing. But we also need to hedge our bets and complicate Beijing's strategic calculations if the PRC ever decides to turn aggressive. Now, how do we do that? Well, the one thing we should do is to encourage the development of multiple centers of power in East Asia and South Asia. The last thing we should ever want to do is to pursue our current policy of smothering the great power ambitions of countries like Japan and India, and thereby creating a brittle, bipolar system in East Asia, where the only two military powers that will really matter 15, 20, 25 years from now will be the PRC and the United States. That is almost an invitation to a challenge by the PRC. If the leadership in Beijing concludes that it's possible to gain a hegemonic position for China in the region by facing down the United States. And we have to maintain our position as the regional hegemon thousands of miles from our homeland, an enormously difficult task. And I would argue that the PRC does not have to match the United States militarily on a global basis to achieve that kind of showdown and the likelihood of a U.S. withdrawal. All it has to do is achieve theater superiority or even theater parity to the point that it can credibly threaten the United States with dire consequences if America intervenes to thwart a Chinese ambition in the region. Instead, if we encourage multiple centers of power, Beijing faces a much more difficult situation. It doesn't merely have to intimidate the United States, it has to intimidate other actors as well. Other countries that have far more at stake in the region than does the United States, and therefore having a much greater incentive not to give in to Chinese pressure. This is the foundation of that more balanced policy. Not coordinating an alliance directed against China, but simply allowing the strategic and security incentives that would naturally apply to other countries in the region if the United States did not insist on maintaining its own hegemonic role and suppressing any security initiatives on the part of these other powers. Thus, I think the initial reaction of the United States to India's decision to unveil its nuclear weapons program was utterly wrong-headed. Although we obviously are not terribly happy about nuclear proliferation, in this specific case, from the standpoint of long-term American interests, that was not necessarily a bad development. Similarly, we have to get the ghosts of World War II behind us in terms of our policy toward Japan, and stop acting as though the Japanese were born with a double dose of original sin, and that somehow Japan is the likely security threat in East Asia, which is often the ugly little undertone in U.S. policy. Instead, Japan is a vital component of a relatively stable system with multiple powers in East Asia. And Japan had better play that role, or there is an enormous power vacuum that either China will exploit or the United States will desperately have to try to fill year after year, decade after decade, as it becomes more and more difficult with a China that has growing economic and military power. Now, is this a perfect solution? Is this the great panacea for a solid policy that will maintain a good relationship between the United States and China? No, it isn't. But relationships between great powers are traditionally very messy. Our interests and those of China in the future are likely to overlap on some issues, and we should always seek avenues of cooperation whenever that occurs. But they're also likely to conflict on other issues, and we better be realistic about that. And perhaps, if we think in that kind of sober fashion about our relationship, we can have a stable, a constructive, and a peaceful long-term relationship with what is going to be, in all likelihood, the leading power in East Asia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for such an orderly presentation, which all of us can see. And on the basis of that, the floor is now open for questions. Yes, sir. The question was, will the United States go to war over Taiwan if there's a Chinese invasion?
The answer to that question is no one knows. And no one can really say with any degree of certainty unless and until that incident occurs. I don't care how many times U.S. officials will say that an attack on Taiwan would be considered a grave threat to the peace of East Asia and that we would feel compelled to take action. No one can really say what the United States will do until an American president has to face that choice. Would a president really put not only American troops, but potentially American cities at risk to defend Taiwan? The Chinese, at least, are skeptical. The rather celebrated meeting between a Chinese general and Ambassador Charles Freeman a couple years ago, in which the Chinese general said that in the past, America could always threaten to escalate the stakes to a nuclear confrontation because China could not respond in kind. So that may have been true in the 1950s or even the 1960s. It's no longer true. And he said, therefore, your threats do not frighten us because in the end, you care more about Los Angeles than you do about Taipei. That is very revealing about the logic being used within the Chinese security establishment. And that general may very well be right.
The question was, if there is peaceful reunification, would that destroy our relationship with Japan?
I'm not sure that
reunification of Taiwan and the mainland.
I'm not sure whether a merger between Taiwan and the PRC, even if we had a more democratic mainland China, would necessarily destroy the relationship between the United States and Japan. But the Japanese would be making certain calculations that it would be difficult, perhaps, for Japan to really compete strategically with China anymore. And Japanese would wonder even more than they do today, and believe me, they wonder a lot today, about just how reliable the alliance with the United States might be under such circumstances if they had to confront a very strong and assertive China. I think it's a hypothetical question on several levels because I'm very skeptical whether the Taiwanese would agree to reunification under any terms, even with a fully democratic China.
It's been said by many, and I heard the son of Mr. Khrushchev say it again today, that the Cold War was the safest period in recent history. The question is, could we be going into the same period with China?
There certainly is an argument that the balance of terror worked. On the other hand, I'm enough of a pessimist to have concluded we may have just been luckier than we had any right to expect. And one should not generalize from one example that the possession of nuclear weapons by various parties are automatically a stabilizing factor. That may be true during the Cold War era. And I know a good friend of mine, Kenneth Waltz at the University of California, argues that nuclear weapons are in fact stabilizers. I remain a bit of a skeptic on that. And I think it depends very much on the totality of the circumstances. In our confrontation with the Soviet Union, we had a number of things going for us. That, first of all, the main strategic prizes of Northeast Asia and Western Europe were deemed so important to the United States that any Soviet leader had to know that there was at least a very good chance the U.S. would honor its commitments. So a threat against those strategic prizes would be a high-risk gamble indeed. In addition, we were lucky because of the Marxist-Leninist orientation of the Soviet leadership. And I know that sounds strange, but what that meant was that the Soviet leaders were so confident that their movement would ultimately prevail that there was no need to rush history. Why take undue risks? And where the Soviets probed, they tended to do so in marginal areas. In other words, they limited the likelihood of a devastating U.S. response against the Soviet homeland. In any confrontation with China, both factors are very different. The issues that are likely to arise, for instance, the status of Taiwan, that is something that's likely to matter much more to Beijing than it does to us. We like the Taiwanese. Taiwan is an important trading partner of the United States, to be sure. But when it comes to Taiwan, it is a gut emotional issue for the vast majority of Chinese. They may be willing to take risks to recover Taiwan that would be far greater than the risks America would likely be willing to assume to protect Taiwan. Also, because of the emotional, the nationalist feeling, would Chinese leaders be as coldly calculating and as risk-averse as the Soviet leadership was during the Cold War? I tend to think not. So the situation with a nuclear-armed America and a much more robust nuclear-armed China could be far more dangerous than was the confrontation during the Cold War.
The question is to the topic of the day, even though the quote is from '97. And what do you think of the Chinese entrepreneurial spirit with respect to enhancing its military?
I guess I would say that it has been a fairly long-standing policy of the PRC to try to get its hands on any element of possibly militarily relevant U.S. technology that isn't nailed down, and perhaps a few things that are nailed down. Now, what the PRC is able to do with all of that technology is a more murky question. The evidence indicates that the PRC has not been all that successful in integrating foreign technology into the PLA, into the People's Liberation Army, into the modernization efforts. It's run into all sorts of problems as far back as the 1970s and as recently as 1998. In other words, they can get the information, they can get the technology, but when they try to replicate it and integrate it into their military establishment, they find they have all sorts of production bottlenecks and a variety of other problems that make that integration extremely difficult. Now, as the overall Chinese economy becomes more technologically sophisticated, my expectation is that those difficulties will diminish and probably do so fairly rapidly. So whereas the PRC may not have been able to make much use of the information that they received on the W-88 warhead, for instance, at this point in time, it might be quite different in the year 2005 or 2010. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be concerned about.
Given the perhaps authoritarian traditions of the Kuomintang originally, and given the fact you can point to other excellences such as those of the Japanese when it possessed the island, why do we so diligently support the Taiwanese? The Taiwanese leadership of the moment, the Chinese leadership.
First of all, I would say that Taiwan really confirms the thesis of gradual modernization and democratization and the importance of generational change, because what we've really seen over the past decade is the emergence of a new generation of leaders in Taiwan, many of whom were born on the island. The mainland is just a foreign place to them, and many of whom were educated in the United States. And they are as committed to democratic values as probably most Americans are. And I think the decision to transition to democracy in Taiwan is irrevocable. what really sticks in the craw of the leadership in Beijing is that this is a model for Chinese democracy generally. And they know that a good many people within the urbanized elite, at least in China, are looking to Taiwan. And they're asking, if they can do it, if those Chinese can do it, why can't we? If they can have a voice in their government, why can't we? That is a question the PRC political hierarchy does not want asked for obvious reasons. I would take some issue with your contention, though, that we are absolutely determined to defend Taiwan. In fact, U.S. policy is quite deliberately ambivalent. And I've had members of the Clinton administration tell me that this ambiguity is absolutely important. They want the Taiwanese to have doubts about whether we would in fact protect them. And because of that, the Taiwanese will not take precipitous action. For instance, trying to declare an independent Republic of Taiwan, something that would really set the mainland off. On the other hand, the ambiguity should be interpreted in the opposite way in Beijing. Beijing will think, well, the United States probably would defend Taiwan, and therefore the PRC has to be cautious. I responded to this on one occasion by saying, you know, this reminds me of an encounter between a beautiful but not very bright dancer and the playwright George Bernard Shaw. The dancer came up to Mr. Shaw and said, I've admired you for so long. We should get married. Just think of what our children would be like with my looks and your brains. And he said, yes, madam, but what would happen to the poor child if it had my looks and your brains? I worry about a mirror image interpretation of U.S. ambiguity. In other words, that Taipei thinks it has U.S. backing and therefore pushes perhaps a bit harder than might be prudent. And Beijing concludes, on the other hand, the U.S. is bluffing. When push comes to shove, it will not risk Los Angeles or Washington or Baltimore for Taiwan. That could lead to a tragic miscalculation. In fact, this policy is reminiscent of the policy adopted by the British Foreign Secretary Lord Grey on the eve of World War I, assuring the French that they had British backing and yet not conveying that message to the Germans. This did not go down in history as one of the brightest policy initiatives. And I think we need to be a little uneasy about this particular approach that Washington has adopted.
The question was with respect to your theory of the stability of multiple actors, and it might be a good thing that India has the bomb. Do you extend that to Pakistan as well?
I'm mainly interested, for obvious reasons, in India being a strategic counterweight to China and an emerging great power. Pakistan is never going to be a great power. It is never going to be more than a middling power. Every gain always has a price, and the price, obviously, is if India acquires such a weapon, Pakistan, quite predictably, was going to acquire it. That's not an especially desirable development, and quite the contrary. It's not desirable from our standpoint at all. But you have to deal with realities, and instead of lecturing India and Pakistan and demanding that they return to nuclear virginity, which they have no intention of doing, I again would have adopted a more realistic policy, which I think the U.S. is moving toward gradually, and that is assist them in developing defensive nuclear doctrines, developing hotlines, developing early warning systems, so that they don't do something really reckless like adopt a launch-on-warning system. That is how we make a difficult situation a bit safer, and that is a constructive policy instead of pounding the table and throwing a temper tantrum because they have defied our non-proliferation desires.
What would you encourage in Japan in terms of the development of its power, particularly militarization?
It's not so much that the United States ought to make Japan a major power or a major military player. Instead, it's that the United States should remove the barriers to that ambition. Make it clear to Japan that our smothering strategy is at an end, that we do not really want Japan to forever be dependent on the United States for its security and for the overall security and stability of East Asia. And that World War II ended more than a half century ago. It is time for Japan to rejoin the ranks of normal great powers. That doesn't mean militarism. It doesn't mean the kind of aggressively expansionist power that Japan had in the 1930s and early 1940s. Japan doesn't have an incentive to do that in any case. This is almost the quintessential status quo power. It has an enormous stake in the existing global system, economically and otherwise. But that Japan does need to be something more than this barely trusted junior security assistant of the United States. It has important interests in East Asia and beyond, and therefore it needs to adopt policies and the military forces needed to make those policies credible. Now, what does that mean? It means probably spending 1.5% of Japan's GDP on the military instead of 0.9%. Now, that's still far less than the U.S. spends, but it would make Japan a very credible security actor in the region. And I think that should be our goal. It will still be a difficult path for them. They were going to have to conduct a rather agonizing domestic debate about what kind of role Japan should play, and it's going to have to confront some difficult issues with its neighbors that it has studiously avoided since the end of World War II. Specifically, being explicit in apologizing for what Japan did in the 1930s and 1940s.
Well, for a very comprehensive, I think coherent and very clear view, we thank you very much.